broadcasting live from the Business Radio X studios in Houston, Texas. It's time for Houston Business Radio. Now, here's your host.
Hello, Houston. Trisha Stutzel here, bringing you another episode of Houston Business Radio. So, I want to introduce you to my new friend. We were having some fun before we started recording here. I've got Tom Applegarth on the line with me today from Preferred CFO. Tom, I'm really excited to have you on the show with me today.
I'm glad to be here.
So, let's talk HR. But first, tell us more about Tom, and then let's dive into Preferred CFO and the services that you're providing to businesses.
Absolutely. So I've been in HR my entire career. After graduating from business school, I went to work for BP Amico and was with them in an HR role. And then I moved to Payless Shoe Source, which at the time that I worked for them in the 90s, they sold 1 out of every 5 pairs of shoes in the United States.
Wow.
And today they sell 0. So it's still mind-blowing for me. But I was there for 8 years in a bunch of different HR roles. I was worked for Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, where I was the head of HR for one of their divisions that was about $1 billion in sales and 8,000 employees. I worked for a company called Belden that did about $2.5 billion in sales, and I was the head of HR for one of their divisions that was also about $1 billion in sales. I was the head of comp and benefits for them. I did a lot of recruiting, and then I was the chief people officer for a company called Potter Electric. And a couple years ago, I joined Preferred CFO. We do outsourced finance, accounting, HR, and payroll for small companies. And then we also do a fair amount of recruiting for big companies, and a few HR projects. Certainly willing to do HR projects for big companies as well. But we have a great team that's just providing HR support to companies.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So very diverse background where you got to be on the other side of all of the things that you're doing now. You're providing this service to people like you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
fantastic.
Well, that and we're, just a fractional HR leader for small companies where it doesn't make sense for them to hire an HR professional full time because they're too small. Well, we'll put in an HR manager, who's only working part time, and it just saves them a lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about the importance of that. So, small businesses don't necessarily need what I would consider an HR partner or service, right? Because they're small, maybe they don't even have any employees or they have 1 or 2 employees. Now they've grown. Why is it important to allow a service like yours to be a partner in their business?
Yeah, so I think once a small business hires their first employee, they've now taken a step into the government is now a partner with them, because there are all kinds of laws around how you treat your employees, and you can it's kind of like speeding. A lot of times you don't get caught, but when you get caught, you're going to wish you hadn't got caught. We have a client that became a client of ours, in the last 6 or 8 months, and they had somebody doing payroll and HR that didn't really know what they were doing. They were doing lots of other stuff, so not necessarily expected to know what they were doing. And we got in there and we found all kinds of laws, including they have about 100 employees spread out amongst 10 or 15 states. Well, and they're using Paychex to do their payroll. Well,
Okay.
Paychex is a great software and works really well, but you still need to know what you're doing, and you got to jump through a few hoops with Paychex to have them actually pay payroll taxes in certain states. And this company hadn't done that, and so we joined them and said, "Oh well, first thing we need to do is clean this up because you haven't paid payroll, you haven't paid taxes in 5 or 6 states for a year." And, cost them a lot more money to clean that up. There's a few other things that we're cleaning up that hopefully nobody from the government's listening and they don't come after us anytime real soon. But some of those things even for a small business like that, a few of those things can add up to $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 And so I think it's important to have somebody that knows what they're doing. And then the other thing that we really help with is coaching and counseling of the management team. Employees don't often go sit down with their boss and say, "Hey, boss, you're really screwing up. And here, let me tell you how." But that's really one of the roles that the HR manager needs to play is understanding what's going on, getting feedback from employees, and then coaching management on how they can be better.
Wow, what a concept, Tom.
There you go.
It's like a feedback loop, right?
Exactly.
So
Absolutely.
the employees are doing. So before we started recording, I like to shift just a little bit to the conversation that we were having about bringing everybody back to the office. So what are your thoughts around that, especially from an HR perspective and payroll? It makes a difference, I think. Yeah.
It does. And so I speak with a lot of CEOs that are both clients and prospective clients, and then a few of my friends that are CEOs today. And I have yet to meet the CEO that actually has an office. I have a few clients that are totally virtual and don't have an office, and I've never had an office. But the ones that actually have an office, I think they all of these CEOs want to bring people back in the office more.
Mhm.
And the question I always ask them is, help me understand why. And a lot of it's around, I'm not sure we're getting the creativity, the teamwork. There's something about being together that we're missing. And I agree with them about that. But I worry about, okay, if you force people back in the office that don't want to be there, how much creativity and teamwork and, do you think you're really going to get? And so, I think that if you tell, I think if a manager, so, in some of these small companies, the CEO is the manager, and I give them a lot more weight in their decision of whether or not they ought to bring people back in the office. I think back to the CEO of Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. I was the head of HR of $1 billion division, and I shook his hand like maybe 3 times in 2 years. He had no idea what was going on in our business. We had 8,000 employees, $1 billion in revenue, you know, great guy. And Goodyear was like 15 billion in sales. So, we only had 1/15 of his business. So
Right.
I didn't necessarily expect a ton of face time with him, but he had absolutely no idea what was going on in the business. And
Mhm.
so in that scenario, when that CEO and I have no idea what Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company is doing from a work at home perspective because it's been 20 years since I worked there. But, a CEO that is not managing the team, mandating that everybody come back in the office, I question whether or not they really know whether or not that's going to be the best thing. And in most of these organizations that are doing that, that are a little bigger, and the CEO isn't managing all the employees directly, um, almost all of their managers disagree with the CEO and don't think they should force their team to come in. Me personally, I think the manager probably has a better feel for what's going to help them achieve their goals and objectives than
Yeah.
the CEO who may be, 3, 4, 5 people removed from that work team.
Absolutely. And, it's the feedback loop again, where you're talking about having this HR person really understand what's happening with the people in the business and able to convey or relay that message to those who need to hear it. Right. Tell me how this shifts the way your business is operating with these businesses that are going back to the office.
Yeah, so I mean, we're coaching the CEO, and sometimes we're more successful, sometimes we're less successful. But then one of the things that's an easy sell that I think is really good is, all right, you've decided you want to bring people back in the office. Well, before you just totally make that mandate, let's do a employee engagement survey.
Mhm.
And we'll have some questions there about coming back to the office, but then we'll have lots of other questions as well. But I'm a big believer in employee engagement surveys because They really help people provide anonymous feedback, which is the only way you really get, even semi-honest feedback, right? I mean, if people have to put their name to feedback, rarely it happens, but most frequently people are going to pull their punches a little bit. And
Yeah.
so I think that kind of anonymous feedback is good. I think that companies should get help when doing an employee engagement survey, because benchmark data is important. Because, and I'll give you my favorite example. Most companies, if you ask employees, do you think your compensation is, high, low, or about right? Almost, usually way more than half say, I think my pay is too low.
Mhm.
But when you can benchmark that against other companies, because I had one client that, asked that question, came back, they were like, wow, 45%, I mean, 55% of our employees think they're underpaid. Tom, what are we going to do? I'm like, you ought to feel pretty good, because the benchmark is like 40%. You guys are over indexed. You guys
You're in a
you
good
guys are
spot.
doing really well. So don't worry about it. And so you need some kind of stake in the ground to understand and interpret the answers that you're getting from your employees. But I think that's a good first step is, let's see how strongly employees feel about coming back to the office. And, and there's a big difference between telling everybody, yeah, I want you to come back to the office 1 day a week, and I want you to come back to the office 5 days a week, you know. So hey, is there some middle ground here? Let's talk about this. Let's not just, pull a Jamie Dimon and say, nope, everybody's back in the office 5 days a week or you're fired. Or I guess an Elon Musk as well for our federal employees.
Yeah. Yeah, then you have a bunch of employees stomping around, and then you have a bigger HR problem, right? I mean, that's the if you're
Well,
not careful. Mhm.
and ultimately, to me, you really need to measure, what are the 4 or 5 metrics that help us as a company understand whether or not we're successful? Okay. And then if that's what we're measuring, what are the 4 or 5 metrics for each one of the CEO's direct reports that help us understand whether or not their team is successful? And then you ought to be able to take that all the way down to every single employee in the company. And, certainly there's some job functions that are easier to measure than others, but the question I always ask myself is, if you cannot identify the 4 or 5 metrics for that job that tell you whether or not it's being successful, are you certain that you need that job?
Mhm, mhm.
And so, and ultimately, if you're managing an organization, I think you're much better served to manage the 4 or 5 metrics for every person going down the organization. So if you're a CEO and you have 8 direct reports, each one of those direct reports ought to have the 4 or 5 metrics that help you tell if they're successful. If they are exceeding the goals and exceeding your expectations, you ought to go play some golf, because all you're going to do is screw this up if you get in the middle of this. Go play some golf, enjoy some work-life balance. Go think about where your organization should be in 5 years, but don't get into the day-to-day because you are green on all of your metrics. Now, where you're red, all right, now dig in and figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
And if you're only measuring the 4 or 5 metrics of the people that report to you as the CEO, what percentage of their team is in the office probably isn't going to be one of those 4 or 5 metrics
Mhm,
that
yeah.
really tell you whether or not your organization is being successful.
That's right. So, Tom, if someone's interested in having a conversation with you about this, about HR, about all of the work that you're doing out there for these companies, how can they find you?
So you can go to preferred-CFO.com, or you can just Google Tom Applegarth, and it's apple like the fruit, and Garth is in Garth Brooks, so very phonetic. And luckily, my last name is unique enough that if you Google Tom Applegarth Human Resources, I'm the only one who comes up.
Only one that comes up. Your face will be all over the screen, Tom. All over
That's
this.
it. That's it.
Um, can we talk about the importance of outsourcing something so important important to a business. So, and I believe unless you're an expert at payroll or HR, you shouldn't be doing it. So tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that goes for every function. I mean, every small business owner is an expert in some things.
Mhm.
And if you're an expert, well, there's absolutely no need for you to bring on another expert, right? You're the expert.
Yeah.
Um, but if you don't think you're the expert in HR or payroll, you're probably right. And you're going to potentially, there's a lot of people I've worked with over the years that have spent 5, 6 figure sums because they didn't have an expert. And if you're a small company, generally, if you have less than 100 employees and maybe even less than 200 employees, going and hiring an HR and payroll expert is probably costing you more than it needs to.
Mm.
Because especially if you have less than 100 employees, you don't really have a full time job for an HR expert. You're either going to be overpaying or you're going to pay somebody who may say they're an expert, but you're not paying them enough for them to really be an expert. And I've there's a lot of clients that we bring on that had somebody who wasn't an expert but doing the job, and they're just not equipped to do it. It's not their fault. They're an expert in something else.
Mhm.
But and definitely in HR, everybody seems to think that they know what they're talking about. Usually, in a 5 or 6 minute conversation, I can help them understand they don't really know what they're talking about. But it's one of those functions, probably a little bit like marketing too. Everybody thinks they're an expert in HR and marketing, and you know, most of them are probably wrong.
I would agree, and there's so much liability alongside of being your own HR person, right? Or hiring somebody from within, and that happens often. Somebody gets promoted, now they're the HR person, right? And they don't know, and they're not looking at the laws like your company would, and know all of the changes that are happening every. It's not even just every year; it's every few months. There's
Oh man.
something new out there, and that is exactly why someone would want to engage with you. So let's talk about not everybody understands this whole idea of fractional. So you do a lot of fractional work, HR. We talked about the CFO work and some of these other areas that you can do fractional work. So first, explain what that means, fractional, and then tell us the services that you offer in that fractional space.
Yes. So fractional means getting, somebody that has 20 plus years of experience in an area and is an expert and has lots of experience with, big companies, small companies, all sizes of companies. And you're basically hiring them on a part-time basis because you can't afford them on a full-time basis. And you probably don't even have 40 hours a week worth of work if you're a small company. So that's where preferred CFO, for CFOs, controllers, CPAs, HR managers, and payroll managers. That's what we do. Is we have people that are working for us full time, but they're working for 3 or 4 different small companies, and it's just like having your a full-time employee, in that we pick up the phone 24/7. Just like a full-time employee, you don't always get us on the first ring, but we're calling you back really quickly
Yeah.
because we're part of your team, and we're embedded. So it's really the best of all worlds, that you're not paying as much, you're getting the expertise, but you're still getting somebody who's going to return your phone call within, you know, a reasonable amount of time, usually hours. I mean, you call just like when the CEO of Potter Electric used to call me. It might take me an hour or two to get back to him if I was in a meeting or whatever. It's the same with the CEOs of small companies that are now giving me a call or giving somebody on my team a call. I mean, we're returning that call as soon as we can.
Yeah. So bringing this expertise at something affordable for these small businesses. I think that's so important for people to hear. You can have amazing experts on your team and not have to pay for them to be an employee on your team, right? You can use them as a fractional service. And I think that's so important. So, as we start to get to the back end of our conversation, I'd love to hear your favorite story. It could be a client story, some part of you figuring out what you wanted to be when you grew up. I don't know. So, tell us a story, Tom.
Well, my favorite story, and it's, I mean, it's the one I tell the most, because I think one of the things that companies do that can cost them a ton of money is when you terminate somebody. Every time you terminate somebody, there's a potential risk. And so the story I always tell to help people appreciate this risk is when I was involved in we had a plant manager who was managing a plant of about 100 employees, and a horrible plant manager. But he'd worked for the company for 30 years, been around forever, but retired. My hypothesis is he retired, but just didn't tell anybody and kept coming to work occasionally. Um, and so his boss was like, "We need to fire this guy tomorrow." I'm like, "Well, he's been here for 30 years. We probably need to first, if not from a moral perspective, from a legal perspective, we need to give him firm guidance on what are the 4 or 5 metrics he's not hitting that he needs to hit, or we're going to fire him. And let's do it in writing, and let's you and I do it together so we have witnesses. So if this thing ever ends up in court, so
Yeah.
we gave that to him. And a couple months later, his boss is like, "All right, I need to fire him today. He's not hitting those 4 or 5 metrics." Well, he worked here for 30 years. He's, it's only been a couple of months. He's got, he's turning a little bit of an organization. It's not like it's just him personally, right? He's trying to
Right.
change. So let's give him another written warning and tell him, here are the 4 or 5 metrics that your organization needs to improve, or we're gonna have to fire you. So we did that. Couple months later, all right, let's fire him right now. I'm like, okay, all right, I think we can fire him, but, and I'm a firm believer in this, and this incident helped reaffirm it. I'm like, anytime you fire somebody, especially if they've been with you for 30 years, we ought to give them severance if they sign an agreement not to sue us. Just think of it as insurance.
Mhm.
And this guy was like, "No, you've made me waste 4 months. We're not giving him a dime." I'm like, "Oh, dude." So I went to his boss, the division president, and I'm like, "Hey, come on, 30 year, we need to do it." And the division president was like, "No, we're not a dime." I'm like, "It's a mistake." And then the mistake I made is I didn't go to the CEO. I should have. I said, "Oh, it's a mistake, but I guess, you're a division president. I'll let you make a mistake." Made a mistake. Of course, the guy gets a lawyer, sues us. That cost the company $1 million. And the CEO came to see me and said, "Tom, what happened?" And I'm like, "I'm sorry. I should have. I should have come to you. I knew this was going to turn out bad.
Oh
I
my
made a
God.
mistake. I should have come to you. I didn't." Um, you know, and hey, that's what happens. You get a jury of 12, they only need 9. They do crazy stuff. And there's no doubt in my mind we weren't discriminating against him based on age, which was his allegation. But that
Yeah.
doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what's true. What matters is what a defense attorney a plaintiff's attorney who's working on contingency can convince 9 of 12 jurors. That's all that matters.
Right.
And that's why I think you need, the certainly a well-written agreement, severance agreement, and you don't have to give people a lot of money, a week's pay, 2 weeks pay. I mean, you don't have to give people a lot of money, but
Right.
give them a little bit of money, have them sign a properly documented severance agreement. There's a lot of rules there, so make sure you don't just write one out on a napkin. You need to know what you're doing for it to be enforceable in court. But but literally in my 30 plus years, either me or somebody who's worked for me has probably fired over 1,000 people.
Mhm.
And And most of them have signed a severance agreement, and
Okay.
no one who has signed a severance agreement has ever got an attorney to be willing to take their case.
Yeah. Wow. That is a very expensive lesson to learn, Tom.
An
I'm just
expensive
saying.
lesson. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. So, if people want to just remind us how they can find you if they want to have a follow-up conversation with you.
Yes, go to preferred-CFO.com or Google Tom Applegarth and the human resources, and you'll see my LinkedIn and everything else there.
Awesome. And I love that you made reference to Garth Brooks because I kind of like him and it's Houston rodeo time. I'm just
Yeah,
saying.
I like him too. In fact, my wife with our firstborn child said, maybe we should name him Garth. I said, come on, Garth, Applegarth? No,
Yeah,
I have to
tough.
veto that one.
That's tough. It's not a good parenting decision. I'm just saying. Tom, thank you so much for being on with me today. The work that you're doing is really important to small businesses, medium businesses, giant businesses. And I think the more we can educate our small to medium sized business owners, the more they can take advantage of these really great services that are actually affordable. Yeah.
Thank you. It was good to
Thank
be
you.
here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's all the time we have for today's show. Join us next time for another exciting episode of Houston Business Radio. Until then, stay tuned, stay inspired, and keep thriving in the Houston business community.